Carpenter movies get ranked constantly. Best, worst, overrated, underrated. And I realize that this particular framing isn't one that works for me too well anymore. Because some of his films are cleaner, some are messier, and some are influential. But none of that actually explains why certain movies feel more John Carpenter than others. There's a very specific sensibility that runs throughout all of his work. A way he uses atmosphere, treats authority, a way that he trusts the audience to sit with the discomfort rather than explaining everything away. And once you start paying attention to that, the rankings shift. So this is not a best to worst list. This is me ranking Carpenter's films from least to most Carpenter, based on how closely they line up with the instincts that he keeps returning to across his career. And some of these rankings, they might annoy people, and I'm okay with that. I'm Brandy, otherwise known as the Terrorific Lady, and welcome back to Retro Horror School, where we discuss, dissect, and analyze horror from the 1970s through the 2010s. Class is in session. As I was revisiting these films throughout my retrospectives, I kept coming back to certain, I don't want to say rules, but patterns that I noticed that kept repeating. Carpenter works best when the story is simple. He doesn't over-explain emotions or themes, and he doesn't handhold or guide the audience too much. The less a movie tends to feel like it's spelling things out, the more it feels like him. Atmosphere also does a lot of the heavy lifting in his work. Tension builds slowly, silence matters, and mood often carries more weight than plot mechanics. When a film relies too heavily on jump scares or constant escalation, it drifts away from his usual style. Music is another big one. Carpenter's scores function like a heartbeat, as its own character, as part of the story. They sit underneath the film, guiding tension without calling attention to itself. When the score starts feeling flashy or distracting, it loses that restraint. Then there's authority, government, institutions, religion, science, history. Carpenter rarely treats any of them as either safe or reliable. The more film questions authority instead of reassuring us that everything is okay, the more Carpenter it tends to feel. He also consistently centers outsiders, blue-collar characters, loners, people on the fringes or the margins of society. And because this is a constant across all of his films, I'm going to treat it as a baseline rather than a deciding factor. And visually, he's always been more interested in control than spectacle. Framing, blocking, and restraint matter a lot more than budget. Bigger doesn't automatically mean more. Carpenter. As we go through this list, I'm not asking whether a movie is good or bad. I'm asking whether it's aligned with what John Carpenter thinks. Here we go. Number 11 is the original Halloween, which came out in 1978, and this one may raise a few eyebrows. Halloween is obviously essential. There is no getting around that. It is foundational to Carpenter's career and to horror in general. When I started lining up his films next to each other and asking which ones feel the most John Carpenter, this one landed lower than a lot of people might expect. And it's not because it's missing on the basics. You can already see so much of what he'll build on later. The simplicity of the story, how little dialogue it actually needs, the way atmosphere carries the tension instead of constant action, and even this early, the score doesn't function as background noise. It functions as real, solid narrative work. What feels different is that Carpenter's larger worldview hasn't fully settled in yet. The distrust of authority that shows up in a lot of his later films isn't really a focus here. Loomis isn't really challenged, systems aren't being interrogated, and the film isn't asking us to question how power functions because evil is just evil. It's just there.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Visually, you can see him figuring things out and developing his style. And it's very impressive for the budget. That very intentional use of framing and space. So for me, Halloween is the beginning of the conversation rather than the conclusion. You could see the instincts starting to form and bubble and simmer, but they haven't fully locked into place. It's the movie that introduces John Carpenter to the world, but it's not the one that quite yet defines him. Number 10 is The Ward, which came out in 2010, and this one settled pretty quickly for me. The more I think about how Carpenter usually works, the more obvious it becomes that this film isn't operating on his instincts and it's not firing on all cylinders, and it starts with how tension is built. Instead of letting the atmosphere do its work, The Ward relies very heavily on jump scares, which is a step back from Carpenter's usual restraint. You can also feel the absence and quiet of his voice here. He didn't score the film and he didn't write the script either, and both of those things matter in this case. The music doesn't function as storytelling in quite the same way, and here, because of the script, we feel more like our hand is being held rather than we're being trusted. What places it this low on the list is how clean everything is. Authority isn't challenged or questioned. The mystery gets explained and wrapped up nice and neat, and everything is just all well and good by the end. Carpenter usually avoids that kind of closure. He usually, in his films, wants you to be more unsettled than to have the answer handed to you on a silver platter. Even though this looks like a John Carpenter film on paper, it doesn't really feel like it. It plays more like a horror movie that he directed rather than a horror movie shaped by his own personal worldview. Number 9 is Village of the Damned, which came out in 1995. And this is one of those movies that always ends up sounding more Carpenter than it feels. There are definitely familiar elements here. Score feels right. There is an attempt at atmosphere that lines up with his sensibilities. The more I sit with it, the more restrained the film feels, and not in the usual way that Carpenter means restraint. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the film itself is a remake. It stays very close to the original, almost a little too close, and that changes how far it can push into discomfort. Carpenter's strongest films usually feel a little dangerous, like they're poking at something that they're not supposed to. This one mostly plays things straight and in line with the original film that it's based on. Authority is present, but it's not really heavily questioned. Empathy is added in the film, especially through the character David, and you can see those 90s anxieties creeping in, but it never really destabilizes the systems that surround those characters. It's not a bad film, it just feels a little too careful, and Carpenter, at his best, usually isn't. Number 8 is Ghosts of Mars, which came out in 2001, and this is where things start to feel a little bit more louder than they need to be. Carpenter typically lets atmosphere build slowly, but Ghosts of Mars doesn't trust stillness. The editing is busy, the transitions are aggressive, and the film keeps pushing forward instead of letting that dread settle in. You could tell what it's trying to do, that because there's a surface level idea about colonization and power that feels very Carpenter adjacent. It never quite deepens into something uncomfortable. Even the score feels different here. Instead of quietly guiding tension, it grabs too much attention, which pulls away from that slow burn mood that he is so good at. So while the pieces are there, they're not working in the way that they're supposed to work. It feels more forceful than it does restrained, and that's why it lands here. Number 7 is In the Mouth of Madness, which came out in 1994 or 1995, depending on where you look. And this one took me quite a while to place. On a surface level, it feels very Carpenter. The atmosphere is strong, the visuals are clever, and the world feels unstable in a way that feels pretty unsettling. The score does exactly what it needs to do. What shifts it slightly out of his core lane is where the discomfort is aimed. Instead of questioning authority or systems, this one is more about questioning and misreading reality itself. What's real, what isn't, and whether perception can even be trusted at all. The character of John Trent is also a different kind of lead. He's slippery, he's self-interested, and possibly unreliable in terms of an unreliable narrator, which changes the way that the story feels. He's not quite the blue-collar outsider John Carpenter usually centers. It's a fascinating film, and it about targets Carpenter's instincts, but it's not quite rooted in his most consistent concerns. Number 6 is Christine, which came out in 1983. And it gets closer than some people give this movie credit for. The story is simple, the atmosphere is eerie, and the score supports the mood without overpowering it. Visually, the film is controlled, especially with how Christine is revealed and framed. You can really feel Carpenter's sense of style over budget here. Nothing feels flashy for the sake of it. Restraint works. What ultimately keeps it from climbing higher is how authority functions in the story. The people trying to help Arnie, they aren't framed as corrupt or useless. They're present, they care, and they're genuinely trying to do the right thing by him. That kind of empathy softens the Carpenter cynicism just enough to shift the tone. The threat isn't the system, it's Christine, and that difference matters. Number 5 is Vampires, which came out in 1998. And this one settles into place pretty naturally because tonally it feels very Carpenter. It's gritty, mean, skeptical of institutions, and is centered on outsiders who trust no one, especially the church. That part lines up perfectly with his instincts. Where it starts to lose that bit of an edge is in how much it explains. The mythology around Valak is laid out pretty clearly, and the church's role is spelled out rather than left unsettling and ambiguous. Carpenter usually prefers suggestion over explanation. He likes letting the audience sit with unanswered questions. The more this film explains itself, the more that tension softens. It still feels like a Carpenter film, just maybe not him quite at his sharpest. Number 4 is The Fog, which came out in 1980, and this is Carpenter Restraint doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The story is simple, the pacing is patient, and the atmosphere carries almost everything. There's no rush to explain, no need to escalate constantly. The tension just slowly builds. What really pushes this higher for me is where the authority critique lives. The failure here isn't the police or the town leaders in the present, it's history. The town is built on a lie, and everyone benefits from not knowing or asking too many questions. That idea that the past will come back around, whether you want it to or not, feels very Carpenter. It's quiet, controlled, and deeply uncomfortable in the way that it sneaks up on you. Number 3 is Prince of Darkness, which came out in 1987, and this film leans heavily into ambiguity. Science doesn't save anyone. Religion doesn't save anyone. Knowledge itself becomes unreliable. The church, which should represent safety, just turns into another form of misdirection. The premise is complicated, but the film is surprisingly restrained in how it presents it. Carpenter doesn't rush to explain what's happening. He lets the atmosphere do the work, and he trusts the audience to keep up. It's uncomfortable, patient, and deeply cynical, which aligns with the way that he sees the world. This feels like a filmmaker fully confident in letting uncertainty sit. Number 2 is The Thing, which came out in 1982. This one came very close. This one came so close to the top. I really wrestle with this because authority collapses almost immediately. trust breaks down, identity and trust itself becomes unstable. The atmosphere is relentless, and the score works exactly as intended: subtle, persistent, and unsettling. Everything here aligns with his instincts. The only thing that keeps it from taking the number one spot is that very small snippet at the beginning where the UFO crashes into the Earth. It gives away the threat pretty early on. And Carpenter is a director that usually prefers discovery. He likes letting the audience realize the danger alongside the characters. But besides that, this film is pretty much perfect and about operating at full strength. And number one is They Live, which came out in 1988. This is where everything clicks. The premise is simple, the story is straightforward, and the atmosphere carries the message. Authority is questionable, and it's openly complicit. You learn the truth exactly when Nada does. The score stays restrained. The film never explains more than it absolutely has to. It trusts the audience to put the pieces together. This feels like Carpenter fully comfortable with who he is and what he wants to say. Minimalism, distrust, outsiders, style, all those elements working together. For me, this is the most John Carpenter film he's ever made. So that's my ranking, not from best to worst, but from least to most Carpenter. If you disagree with me, well, that's honestly the fun part. Which of John Carpenter's horror films feels the most Carpenter to you, and why? Let me know in the comments. And if you like your horror videos with a side of education and that discuss horror as memory, identity, and survival, then you know exactly what to do. Class is dismissed, everybody, for now. But I'll see you next time. Bye!